Well, we have today UK's High Commissioner to India, Alex Ellis, with us here at the Centre for Social and Economic Progress, which is CSEP for short. It's located in Chanakyapuri in New Delhi. Welcome, Mr. Ellis.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Over the next hour or so, this is going to be as, should we say, relaxed as possible, I hope. Over the next hour or so, depending on your convenience, we'll get into some India-UK relations issues, and then more generally, wider international issues, which are of current relevance and are hitting the headlines. But before I get into the questions, I want to tell our audience that this is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee year, and she has completed 70 years when Queen Victoria did 64. So she is now the longest serving monarch of the United Kingdom. And I'll stop there. Like you to comment whatever you wish to tell us about what is the sense that the people have about this lady whom I had the privilege of meeting, but more of that later.
Well,
High Commissioner.
It is one of the privileges of our profession is that you do meet the head of state, and I am Her Majesty's High Commissioner, so you meet before you go out to posting as well. So she becomes, I think, the second longest serving monarch, unless you go back to the Old Testament, in which case they served for 1,000 years. I think all that's left is Louis XIV of France, of course, French. She is a figure she's a physical embodiment of the state and of continuity. An apolitical figure as head of state, and to whom the people who work for the state associate. So I am Her Majesty's High Commissioner. It's Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service. In other words, she gives a sense of something beyond politics, which is the state. And I like that. I find that motivating. She has been around for a very long time. Most people in the United Kingdom have known nothing other than the head of state being one person. So she commands a great deal of authority from that point of view. She represents continuity. Her first prime minister was Winston Churchill. That gives you an idea. She takes over in 1952. So continuity, the ability to change in order that things can stay the same, to use that old expression, and adapt. And a strong sense of succession. Prince Charles is the heir, so when we had the big celebrations over 4 days a couple of weekends ago in the United Kingdom, Prince Charles was very much present. She was not present for much of it, but present for key parts of it. It's a little elegiac. She's 96. Maybe this will be the last big occasion which you'll see Her Majesty, as it were, in front of her subjects in the United Kingdom. Remember, she is the head of state of more than a dozen other countries as well. So it's quite a moving occasion. It's one of rare occasions I really regret not being in the UK. I would like to have gone. I went to her last big Jubilee in 2002, her 50th, and I made sure to take my family there to see it. So it also marks perhaps the beginning of more of transition. I mean, she's still alive, she's still very much the Queen, I'm sure she'll stay the Queen, but Prince Charles and Duchess of Cornwall being more in evidence tells you something about the future.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That gives us a good sense. If I may share my own personal experience, I was fortunate enough to be in London in 2012, 10 years ago, when it was her Diamond Jubilee year, and she was unbelievable in terms of her energy to attend all the events at that time. And as you might recall, it was also the year that London hosted the Summer Olympics. So I had this double
an auspicious year.
That's right. Fortunate experience, because I was representing India in London at that time. And I remember Sebastian Coe. I think he was the chair of the organizing, Sir Sebastian Coe. For those who don't know, he was a very famous middle distance runner. Young people may not remember, but he was an incredible runner, and he was chairing the organizing committee. And I think the way everything went, like clockwork, I'm sure there were many others who were helping him. But okay, now we move on to...
Lord Coe's mother, I think, was Indian.
Yes. I mean, Indian in the sense of having been born here, or was she Indian?
Ethnically Indian. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
I think so.
See.
I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
Okay, that's a very interesting piece of information I picked up from you today. But now, moving on to other issues, India-UK bilateral economic relations. When the Prime Minister was here, the UK Prime Minister was here in April, there was a lot of talk about a bilateral trade agreement, and I think discussions have started, so if you could fill us in on that. And beyond that, not just trade, but also investment.
Sure. So the UK-India economic relationship is obviously a big one, not least because we are roughly the same size economy. It's roughly 5th and 6th in the world. India will become bigger, obviously, over the next decade, up to about the 3rd biggest economy in the world. So you'd expect that, and you'd expect that given the history of the two countries. That said, actually, our trading volumes are rather lower than you might expect, considering the history. And history matters in trade as well as geography. And our relative weight, the UK's relative weight in India has dropped over the last 2 decades. You would expect that as well as India diversifies into more trading partners. And also you have the enormous growth of China in the last 20 years. Nevertheless, I think we can do better than we are at the moment. And that's why we launched the free trade agreements negotiations as part of a package of agreements which the two prime ministers announced when they met virtually in the middle of the second wave just over a year ago. We had agreements on trade, agreements on mobility, on the environment, particularly around climate change in the Glasgow conference of late last year, defence and security, I think, now catching up. So they said, we've got to double trade. And a free trade agreement is a way. It's a way towards an end. It's just a way in which you can help to accelerate the growth of trade between the two countries. Negotiations have got quite far, quite fast. I think India is very determined, from what I can see, to reach trade agreements with some key strategic partners. And I'll come back to that in a second. So we're agreeing with Australia, agreed with the UAE, negotiating with Canada already, just a bit behind us, and with the European Union, I think, just opening negotiations even as this week. So India, having had a burst of free trade agreements and not really liked them in some ways, has now come back and wants to do more. Why are we doing this? There are clearly economic benefits to both countries. They're quite different economies, quite different structured economies, so actually there isn't too much overlap. They're kind of quite a neat fit for their difference. The UK, having left the European Union completely, is now getting out there and agreeing a lot of new agreements, and India will be the first one which we do with an economy of a GDP per head very different to ours. Until now we've done Canada, we've done Australia, and so forth. So it's quite a new kind of agreement for us. You get lower tariffs, you get easier establishment of services, you get more competition. That is healthy for both countries. Classic trade theory of David Ricardo. You hope to add new bits to a trade agreement now. So digital trade, for example, which will grow enormously over the next decade. Very big in India already, very big in the UK already. So you want to add some stuff around that, some of the new areas of trade as well. You'll need investor protection because India historically has not always been, there have been some big famous cases involving expropriation, taxation, of which Cairn Energy is perhaps the most famous British company, which in the end, in your government, actually reached a settlement. And so you need that investor protection. Mobility, I'm sure will come up. We might come back on to the flow of people between the two countries. That'll be an element. I'm sure the Indian side will be interested in that, but mobility of temporary workers between the two countries and so forth. So there are good economic reasons for doing that, and you want to add new areas which will help to give more economic benefit. I think you're also doing it for more than just economic reasons. I think there is geostrategy to trade now as well. Geopolitics has come back into trade, as our Foreign Secretary would say. And so it can't be a coincidence that the countries with whom India and the UK are doing trade deals are very similar. Canada, Australia, the GCC in our case, UAE in the case of India, because there's that sense that we need to diversify, and that's partly about China, and we need to get closer economically to our trusted partners. And so that is, I think, a bigger driver. And that's apparent, I think, from the way the two prime ministers looked at it and also said to the two teams, you need to get on with it, you need to try and settle by Diwali, which is what we are planning to do.
Great, by Diwali. Well, that's something to literally light up both capitals. But moving on to something else, as a student of physics in Delhi University, I was very familiar with Lord Rutherford's work about the structure of the atom or Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism. I'm not going to quiz you.
I'm hoping not.
I'm not going to
My
quiz
history
you.
degree prepared me ill for this particular question.
No. I was going to move on to the fact that many in India have used the AstraZeneca, this particular vaccine against COVID-19, and it's known here as Covishield or something like that. But they may not be aware that the origins of that particular vaccine, which is produced in Pune, but the actual development of the vaccine was done in Oxford University, perhaps with a company called Jenner something or the other. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that the UK has historically had researchers in both areas of fundamental research in the pure sciences, whether it is mathematics, physics, or chemistry, and also in the applied sciences, as in the medical sciences. What are the prospects of a little more collaboration? I'll just throw out a few names like the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. I won't mention the Bhabha Atomic Research Center because there are some issues there when it comes to nuclear energy and related work. But what about our IITs? I know that at one point of time, I forget which IIT that the UK was actively supporting and helping in the development of. So what is happening in those kinds of applied technology areas?
So thank you for mentioning Covishield, because you're absolutely right. It's a great UK-India story. The best thing the UK and India have done together in the last 2 years is the Covishield vaccine, which I think over 1.5 billion doses have been given to people in India, but also around the world, including the United Kingdom, including our own Prime Minister. Who had, I think one of his jabs was a Covishield jab. And the story is an interesting one about the UK and about the UK and India. So right at the start of COVID, almost immediately, the UK does two things. It puts out the taxpayer, my taxes, seed fund research into possible vaccines. And the UK has an absolutely outstanding, if not the best in the world, and amongst the best in the world, applied science base. And so different places around the UK start in the race for the vaccine. And in fact, it is the Jenner Institute in Oxford University which gets there first. So it's a bit of taxpayer money to an outstanding public university, remember. Which then goes into partnership with AstraZeneca, the UK-based pharmaceutical firm, which produces the vaccine. And one of the things, the story should be told more about Covishield, is that the academics who make the vaccine make as a condition that AstraZeneca can't profit from it, that they had to sell it at cost. So AstraZeneca, Covishield is far cheaper than some of the other vaccines, far cheaper. It's one of the reasons why it can reach India in such an effective way. And then the Serum Institute, which has this huge manufacturing might and expertise in the making of vaccines, comes in. By the way, originally an institute which worked on horse vaccines with some research help from UK institutions at the beginning of the 60s. That's how it starts. So UK public money, outstanding public university, British company connected with a really vast Indian company. And then you have global impact. In other words, a bit of the UK developed IP and India's manufacturing might come together, have an enormously beneficial impact around the world. So it's a great story, but in a way, it's the model of cooperation. But you're absolutely right, you shouldn't stop there. And the good news is we haven't. So for example, the Serum Institute and I think the Jenner Institute in Oxford are now in stage 3 trials of a malaria vaccine. You have India has now joined the huge recovery trial, which is a trial of therapeutics rather than vaccines for COVID, which is looking at one particular, if I remember rightly, commonly available anti-arthritis drug, and trying that in India to see if that will have good long-term effects. Because the UK was also very, very fast to try therapeutics, and within a couple of months had discovered that a very commonly produced steroid, mainly in India, dexamethasone, had very beneficial effects on COVID patients. So actually it's triggered quite a lot more research. But there are other areas as well in health, just to mention that. So we are creating a partnership, a digital health partnership between the Indian government, the National Health Institute here, and the NHS in the UK for how do you get, for example, patient records into a cloud in a way which is more accessible. India is very, very good on mass popular digital governance, and we're sort of trying to learn from that. So there's a lot going on. Research beyond health is also increasing quite a lot. UK is India's biggest research partner in Europe. And when we come together as researchers, our combined impact is far higher than if we were researching separately, as is often the case in collaboration. So we are doing quite a lot all over the country, and in terms of research, particularly on climate change and on sustainability, the kinds of crops which will be sustainable in the future, some of the other technologies, green hydrogen, for example. So there is a lot going on. Some of that is public-to-public research and sort of institutes of excellence in the two countries. Some of it actually, I think, can be more with big companies, because India has some very good research. You mentioned the Tata Institute for one. There are some other very strong institutes from private companies. So I think that will be the future as well. How do you adapt, for example, a wind turbine blade to Indian conditions? I went down to the Indian Wind Institute down in Chennai when I first arrived, and we're working with them on things like that. So I think it'll be a big growth area. And that has to be underpinned, going back to the roadmap agreed between the two prime ministers last year, by the flow of people between the two countries. The ability of the two countries, the people in the two countries to be able to come together and collaborate. And that has benefits, and we might come back to this later, not just for the UK and India, but as we saw in the case of Covishield, much more globally. Because India, I think, is very strong on what you might call frugal innovation which is more readily applicable to other countries around the world.
And perhaps affordable, as you mentioned at the outset. Thank you so much, Mr. Ellis. I was educated by what you just said, because I just know about this from newspaper headlines. That was very useful. Moving on to another area which makes for closer bilateral relations, which is cooperation in the field of defense. Defense, by definition, many things get classified. By classified, for those who, this is more a government term, it means secret. Some things cannot be made public for a long time after they have happened. So obviously we can't talk about things which are classified. But I know that Prime Minister Boris Johnson mentioned when he was in Delhi in April that there might be collaboration in the production of electric engines for ships and so on. So would you like to tell us a little bit? I think to some extent India is hampered in its collaboration with the West generally, and UK in particular, because at times companies like Rolls-Royce produce engines for fighter aircraft or aircraft which are used for defense purposes, while in India practically all elements of defense production fall within the public sector. So if you could touch upon both aspects. One is high-tech collaboration in defense, and is there an issue about public to private, and in that context I remember that Government of India is trying to make it much easier for foreign companies to invest in India and set up either wholly owned or majority owned subsidiaries.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So I think that's defence and security is one of the kind of 5 main pillars of the roadmap agreed last year. I think it's the one which needs the most oomph at the moment, and that's why the Prime Minister came here, and he was absolutely determined to come here and see Prime Minister Modi. Remember, he tried to come twice before, and COVID in the UK and then in India had meant postponement of those 2 visits. So when he came, they talked a lot about defence, and that's partly against, there's a context, 2 contexts I would say in that. One is the context of China, and a more assertive tie in China under Xi Jinping. And the other is the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. India has quite high dependency on Russian materiel, and I think it's been changing that over the last decade or so, and I get the impression wants to accelerate that reduction in dependence. And traditionally, UK and India collaborated a lot on defence, and that's declined again a lot in the last 20 years. So there's clearly an Indian desire for indigenization at Minar Bharat in defence, and that's understandable. I think any country wants to have more resilience in its defence production. We do collaborate already in some areas, and we are on new research projects. So if you break down defence, there's cooperation between the armed forces. And that was very evident when we had our carrier strike group, our big carrier task force, which came through India, the Indian Ocean into India last year. The biggest deployment we've done in this region for the last 30 years, maybe even since the Second World War, actually. We are on the verge of signing a whole series of agreements to facilitate that cooperation between the armed forces. So that's one part of it. The second part is research. And we are doing work between the UK and India on propulsion marine engines, particularly on electric marine engines, which we have learned and put in our own ships far more effective, and also jet engines for future jets, fighter jets. And there we are collaborating actually between Rolls-Royce and the Indian HAL, I think is an Indian public partner. So it is possible to do the public and private partnership in this area. But we think there's scope to do much more. UK has very good defence research base, along with a few other countries. And we also think that from that we hope will flow more industrial collaboration. Rolls-Royce and BAE Systems are the two most well-known companies in the UK, but there are others as well which have niche technologies. For example, in underwater maritime awareness, and also in the air as well, and also some missile systems. And the sad truth is that one of the consequences of the last 5 years is we're all going to have to spend more on defence, and we know it. And that, I think, is something best done between countries where we can. The UK has a long history of collaboration, and I think that India is both wanting to indigenize but also work with its trusted partners. So again, it can't be coincidental that we're looking to collaborate in there just as we're looking to do in a free trade agreement. These are all areas, all more research. In other words, you're trying to solidify a relationship of higher trust. The other area which I think will be ripe for strong collaboration is on cyber, and particularly defensive cyber. So all of our countries, sometimes in the private sector, our critical national infrastructure, our electricity supply is subject to heavy cyber attacks, also the public sector as well. How do we work on that? How can we work together technically on that? How can we work in policy terms on that? That's another area which I think we'll try and work on more over the next few years.
That's very useful. Mr. Ellis, I'm somewhat embarrassed to mention that Delhi is rated as a city with perhaps the worst air quality amongst major cities around the world. Now, obviously, both the Delhi government and the central government are concerned about not just pollution in Delhi, the central government particularly, in terms of how do we do more to provide cleaner water in our taps to people. Everybody is now drinking bottled water because you're not sure about the kind of tap water you're getting. But you can do something about water, you can boil it. You can't do much about the air you're breathing in unless you're wearing some kind of a mask all the time. Yeah. Now, is there scope for some collaboration there? Because I hear every year that there is some burning of stubble in Punjab and Haryana after certain crops are harvested and so on and so forth. Has that ever come up in discussions between the two countries as to what we can do, taking advantage of the experience of the UK and more broadly developed countries?
So air quality is an issue which a lot of people will raise when they're sitting in the United Kingdom thinking of bidding to come and work in the British High Commissioner in Delhi. So it matters to me personally because it affects all of us, but also because I want to attract really talented people here, and sometimes they're put off by the air quality. There's kind of mitigation and there's adaptation, isn't there? We adapt, for example, we all have to do air purifiers and stuff like that, which work pretty well. Just to sort of step back on the historical perspective, before I came here, I went on my favorite nerd website, Our World in Data, which is a fantastic website, a fantastic open resource, wonderfully done by Oxford University, and I looked up air quality, historical air quality all over the world. The air quality in Delhi today is roughly the same as the air quality in London in the 1930s. So there's nothing new under the sun. This was a problem in the UK. It was a problem in a lot of cities actually in the developed world. Changed in the early 50s by the Clean Air Act, and all of those who've watched The Crown may remember an episode from the first series which features actually the London smog. And my father, when he was a Londoner, when he started working, he can remember leaving. He was a teacher, and he left a classroom, walked outside, and just could literally not see more than about 2 yards ahead of him. So. I think you need to put it in perspective. This has been a problem for many cities all over the world. My wife started, she finished her high school in LA in the early 80s. Appalling air quality in LA in the early 80s. These are solvable problems, but there's a lot of politics in air quality. We do analysis. So The Lancet, a great British magazine, did a huge study on the economic consequences of the health consequences of poor air all over the world, including in India a couple of years ago. Fascinating read. Provides an economic case for why you should change air quality. And we do a lot, I would say, through our work on climate change. So the UK and India, like India and a lot of other countries, we do a lot of work together on climate change. A lot of research, a lot of investment. So we have public funds. We put money into funds which invest in small, clean companies alongside the Indian government. So I'll give you one example. There's a company which is reseeding and recovering destroyed or semi-destroyed land or on the outskirts of Delhi, and rewilding it and making it healthy again, improving the soil, planting trees and so forth. Has a big impact, by the way, on the quality of the environment. There's another company which they're investing in. It's through a fund which is turning agricultural waste not into stubble to be burnt, but into energy. And these are all things which in the end both have very beneficial effects for the Indian economy more generally, but also on the air quality. So that's how we go about it. And the other day I saw the Chief Minister of Delhi and his deputy, and we were talking about traffic management. Because again, how cars circulate, where you allow them to go and so forth. We do big research together on electric vehicles. We now have big producers of electric buses, for example, British firms who produce electric buses in India. So I think in the end, a lot of this, you can set some big targets, as we did in Glasgow in the Climate Change Summit last year with the help of Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Johnson, and Alok Sharma chairing it. A good example, a British politician who was born in Agra, son of the transformation of British politics and the beneficial Indian influence on it. You can set big targets, and then I think companies actually, alongside applied research, as we were discussing earlier, really make the transformation. The doers tend to be companies, and that's an area which we have invested in a lot in the last decade or so.
Useful again. Now turning to the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We have to address that issue because it is having a negative effect around the world, whether it is oil prices, because currently it is about, $108 per barrel of Brent crude, food prices, which affect a number of countries. We are lucky to have some buffer stocks, but many other countries are not. If you look around the world, the US, I think recently the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. I think the Bank of England has raised interest rates. Inflation is hitting double digits. I'm using the word inflation loosely, whether in India, the wholesale price index was up at 13% a month or so back. Retail or CPI, that is the consumer price inflation, was at 8%. And if you were to go by a story in The Economist, I think it's the latest or the one...
That's right, the one before.
But the one before, where they are kind of holding out somewhat grim prospects for UK in the next 5 years, also taking into account the impact of Brexit and so on. Given all this, what is the way forward? Is there... I think we all know about the history between the United Kingdom and Russia in the 19th century, but of the Great Game. And those who are not aware of it can just go and put it in Google and they'll come to know what is the great or what was the Great Game. But how do you see this going forward? I have some other questions on this, but
Sure.
I'd like your broad overview on this issue first.
Yeah, let's go broad. So a few things which I think are happening to the global economy. Let's step back from Russia's invasion of Ukraine for a second. And just to pick, if I may, side one point, I think the people who are really suffering from Russia invading Ukraine are the Ukrainians, because they're being killed by the Russians, a totally extraordinary act of flagrant breach of every rule by the Russians. The global economy, I very much agree with what you said. Cheap money is over. We've lived off cheap money now for the last 15 years or so since the financial crash. That's now over. The period of very rapid growth of trade and globalization has probably come to an end. Not necessarily unwound, but that speed of growth has now declined very sharply. You have a more geopolitics has come into trade. I think the kind of multilateral cooperation is much harder. We saw that. I mean, the World Trade Organization did pretty well to get to where it did to in the last week's ministerial meeting, but it's getting very hard to get global agreements on anything, climate change perhaps being the one exception to that. So there are some big changes. I'm nicking some of this from Arvind Subramanian, who wrote the other week in the Financial Times about this. But there are some big changes going on which are affecting everybody. More expensive money, higher inflation, pressure on commodities, those are all happening. And some more currency fluctuations actually are happening as well. So that's not really, it's about Russia and Ukraine, and it's not really about the UK, that's what's happening all over the world. Then you have the Russia-Ukraine issue, that's undoubtedly.
Add-on, yeah.
Yeah, that is add-on, and you have, and we can come back to it, the consequences of Brexit, the pluses and minuses of that, and what that's doing to the UK economy in particular. But there are some sort of global forces which are affecting everybody. Should we talk a bit more about, should we go to Ukraine a bit more?
Yes, I think so, because I would agree with you that Russia should not have invaded Ukraine because of the human costs involved. I'm most concerned about human costs. Lives have been lost, and there should be some way for countries to be able to figure out their differences. All this stuff, John Mearsheimer of Chicago University talking about the history of Russia warning the West in general and the NATO countries in particular that they shouldn't offer a NATO membership to Ukraine and so on. Abstracting from all those strategic issues, it is unfortunate that so many lives have been lost, so much property has been destroyed, and others have been hurt. Somebody's lost a limb, etc. So abstracting from all the horror and the consequences of this ongoing conflict, my sense, and I submit for your views, is that the international community has to figure out some way of bringing this to an end, because it will have ripple effects all over the world. How exactly to bring it to an end, this is not the place, because governments have to decide how to work this out and how to encourage Russia to come to the negotiating table. Russia will say, we are already at the negotiating table in Turkey. It's Ukraine which is not doing so. Some of these things have to be done behind the scenes, as we know. Not everything can be done in the full glare of television cameras and so on. Right now there are, I think yesterday deliberations started, the EU deliberation started yesterday, and I think the next thing is that the G7 will meet in the Bavarian Alps from Sunday onwards in Germany. And then I think everybody moves on to Madrid for the NATO. Yeah. So I think this is an ideal situation. You have the EU gathering in Brussels, I presume. Then you have this G7 meetings, to which I believe our Prime Minister will be going as a special invitee, as Indian Prime Ministers have been going. Yeah. And then NATO. Yeah. Now, I think this is an ideal set of circumstances for countries to figure out what is it that can be done to bring this conflict and the human and the negative consequences for all the humans involved. And I'm even including Russian soldiers. The average soldier on the ground he is not taking these decisions. He
Yeah.
is also a recipient of decisions taken far away in Moscow. And if I might just add, it's become a rather long question, more a comment, that Mr. Putin is probably worried about democracy rather than NATO membership of Ukraine. And he's worried also about the fact that even today, Russia's per capita income in purchasing power parity terms is about 52% that of Germany. And I think thinking people in Russia might have a problem with that.
Sure.
Now, with that as a backdrop,
Well,
High Commissioner, over to you.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, what's going on is going on because Russia invades Ukraine. There's no other reason for it than that. Russia decides to invade another sovereign country, breach its borders, kill its people, for the exercise of power. Very often in international affairs, things are quite shades of grey. I think in this case, it's not very shades of grey. And the idea that this is provoked by NATO is utter nonsense. First of all, so Ukraine is not part of NATO. And indeed, when this was a possibility, NATO was extremely cautious about this and did not offer membership to Ukraine because exactly the reasons you give. Secondly, the original Russian action against Ukraine to occupy part of Ukraine is a response actually not to a NATO action, but to a Ukrainian action to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. And I think it is driven by exactly what you say, that fear of a successful, thriving democracy on its border. And it already has that fear because the countries which belong to the Soviet Union, which reclaimed or claimed their sovereignty, the Baltic states, Estonia, for example, Poland, have all fantastically prospered away from the ex-Soviet control and as independent nations. Thirdly, there's not an abstract body called NATO. There are just free countries which decide we are a free country, we wish to achieve this path, so we choose to join NATO or we apply to join the European Union. It's not automatic and sometimes they're not let in. So those are sovereign choices. So I think that what's happened is essentially a Russian, in my view, completely unprovoked aggression which has had disastrous consequences for many, many people, and a vast displacement of people, of millions of people now coming into homes in the UK and all around the world. So some going back now, which is good into Ukraine. So, and secondly, what happens next? And by the way, I should say that the UK, like other countries, has not been putting troops into Ukraine. We have not put large amounts of people. What we have said is supplied materiel. And that partly goes to your second point, which is about how does this end? Now, the Russians, it's quite apparent from Russian behavior, they're not going to, they want to end it by military conquest, by overwhelming force of arms, which they get completely wrong to start with because they enormously underestimate the will of Ukrainian people and the leadership of Ukraine to resist another country simply walking over the border and invading them. I think the UK will always have the view that autocratic control coercion is not a thing we want to encourage in any part of the world. External autocratic coercion. So we supply material. We had in fact been training the Ukrainian army for 7 years after the 2014 invasion by Russia of parts of eastern Ukraine. And that training matters, I think, because you have quite an effective Ukrainian armed forces. So if the Russian tactic, or it appears to be, is to by overwhelming force crush the Ukrainian opposition, so far unsuccessfully, if you want to have any decent negotiating leverage, you need to have some pretty strong force on the other side, because that is the basic, those are the chips which you're playing with at the moment. So that's why the UK and other countries, and the United States probably number one, but many others have been supplying material and other kinds of expertise to Ukraine. How does this end? I think is originally determined by military and then turns into politics. And again, Ukrainian leadership actually is one we have to watch. We're not neutral in this. We support democracies, liberal democracies, and we try to dissuade external autocratic coercion. So I don't know how it will end, but I think you have to look and see what President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine, where their instincts go. But you can't have a real negotiation unless you have sufficient force on countering Russian force.
Well, I'm hoping that the economic cost and also the human cost that Russia is suffering would bring them to the negotiating table. You are still actively in government, and I was in government. We have seen several instances where you have to kind of hold your nose and talk to people and deal with them, even though you don't really want to even meet them. Sure. Take the Saudi Arabia case. I believe the Crown Prince was in Turkey recently. Even though the Turkish intelligence, which had bugged the Saudi consulate, had tapes and released them to the public of Khashoggi being, pardon me, tortured and killed. And I believe President Biden will visit Saudi Arabia next month. I think, going by newspaper reports, to try and encourage them to increase oil production, to try and bring down global prices of oil. So without finding fault with this country or that country, in every country, and I don't need to tell you about the Chilcot report and the whole Iraq situation and so on, whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not in Iraq and what all happened. And Iraq, frankly, even today is like 30, 40 years behind what it was. And Saddam Hussein was a dictator, and a brutal, brutal dictator. But somehow the solution, if it is worse than the problem, we need to rethink the solution. You don't need to answer that question, because these are issues which governments are grappling with at the level of heads of government. And maybe you just want to give a sense of how you feel, given that this is an imperfect world, and many parts of the world, the countries are ruled by autocrats or by hereditary rulers, as they are in the Gulf and what we call West Asia and you call Middle East. Yeah. What do we do? I mean, it's obvious that Russia should not have invaded. They should have figured out some way to talk to the Ukrainians. Crimea was annexed by Catherine the Great a long time ago, at the end of the 18th century. So Khrushchev gave it back to Ukraine. So lots of history, we can keep going back and forth. Why don't we sit down and negotiate? So what is your sense, given the kind of difficulties that the world finds itself in? And I'll end it with a question, because I've again spoken too long. At times in the Western media, it seems as if India is being asked to choose between Russia and the West. And then Indian commentators turn around and say that, why don't we ask Europe and the UK to choose between India and China, given our border issues with China? Government cannot say it clearly, but I can tell you there is very strong feelings about what happened in April 2020 in the eastern part of Ladakh. Okay. So basically, can we choose between Russia and the West, we meaning India, and can the West in general choose between India and China, given the fact that the world perhaps needs both of these large populous countries, and China is ruled by a communist dictatorship?
Sure. So let's not go too back into history, but let's remember that Saddam Hussein decides to invade another country for absolutely no reason, and we actually go in and support that country to drive back those troops. So that's very often forgotten when we talk about Iraq. The first Iraq War was exactly dealing with an autocratic, coercive dictator who wanted to invade another country, did invade another country.
Kuwait, yes.
Yeah, in 1991. So, 1990, excuse me. So, if you're going to negotiate, though, you want to negotiate from a position of strength. And what strikes me is the UK is prepared to take economic costs. We referred to earlier, well, the UK is looking like it's going to recession. We are prepared to take economic costs in order to try and preserve the value of freedom and openness. And we are taking an economic cost. There's no doubt about it. We are taking in not as many refugees as some other parts of the world, but a reasonable number as well, including I was talking the other day to a politician who's just a British politician who's just taking Ukrainians into his house to stay in his house. That's what is going on in the UK at the moment. So, we are prepared to take a cost. Your point about India is a very interesting one. So the first thing I'd say is I think any country, and it's certainly India, well, India is going to be for India. I don't see why India chooses one or the other. India chooses India. strikes me as entirely natural for any country to identify its interests and decide to pursue them. And I am very wary of anyone forcing me to choose between things, and therefore of trying to force others to choose things. People will choose what they feel is in their long-term interest to benefit them. So I'm not a kind of, you've got to choose. I think that what's interesting to me are two things. One we've discussed about, which is the speed of change, reduction in Indian dependency on Russian material, which, by the way, is pretty rational when you consider the performance of the Russian material in the Ukrainian war to date. And then secondly is the accelerated shift away from imported hydrocarbons by India. There's a big cost in imported hydrocarbons, but there's also security elements as well, and therefore the enormously rapid growth in renewable energy. And I referred earlier to the partnerships which exist and will grow between the UK and India in renewable energy, whether that is offshore wind or use of renewable energy, for example, for electric vehicles, or the creation of green hydrogen. So those are areas of partnership, which actually I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually encouraging that partnership to grow. You asked about Russia and China. Well, first of all, I think I have the sense that India feels we will look after our border. We expect, there was no kind of great Indian appeal to the world in 2020, so we will look after our border. India's knows that border incredibly well, is deeply practiced in how you deal with land issues in relation to its neighbors. So, and secondly, I think that, the West, I say the United Kingdom, is pretty clear who it's choosing. It's choosing democracy, liberal democracies. It's choosing open societies. That's what it's choosing. And if you look at India and China, it's pretty clear which one scores better on terms of democracy. And China explicitly is not a democracy. That is its path. It's chosen. So I think if you look at the nature of our relationship with India and the ambitions set by the two prime ministers when they met just over a year ago for this comprehensive partnership we now have, it's pretty clear which way the UK is going. Now, the UK, like India, like many other countries, has to find a right balance with China between cooperate in some areas, increasingly compete and contest at times. UK doesn't have a land border with China, doesn't have that experience, but all of China's present power is so strong all over the world that we're seeing that more and more, not just in the South Asian continent, but elsewhere as well. So the UK's choice is clear. We're for freedom and openness.
Thank you. That was very clear. Now, moving to maybe the second last question for today, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and Quad.
Yeah.
Now, India is part of both because it's part of this four-nation Quad and it is part of IPEF. I'm sure you would have noticed commentaries out of China. They are uncomfortable with both because they see while the statements don't identify China, they feel that it is all directed against China's overall interests. Where is the UK on this? I mean, I'm curious to know. I mean, the Quad is by definition 4 countries,
Sure.
but you could have thought of a term which has 5 countries. So UK did not choose to be part of Quad or did not choose to be part of IP. Of course, you could claim that UK is far away from the Pacific, but UK has had a global presence
Sure.
for more than 2 centuries.
Yeah.
So to that extent, I don't see any contradiction
Yeah.
between UK being part of an enhanced or larger Quad or part of IPEF.
Yeah.
What would you like to say on that?
So you're absolutely right. The UK has been a global country. It's an unusually global country, actually, given its location. Anyone who's lived there will see that. You see that in our patterns of trade. We get investment from a far more diverse group of countries than the other European countries. And our trade as well is much more diverse in its shape than, say, the trade of France or Germany, although Germany is a bigger trader than the UK. You see it in our population, which is changing very fast, and that is expressed now in having 3 cabinet members of Indian origin. I think when you have a Minister of Finance called Rishi Sunak and an Interior Minister called Priti Patel, that tells you something about what's happening in the UK. And it has has, I think, 7 points of presence in the wider Indo-Pacific region. If you include in that, as I think you should, the littoral of East Africa, because I think that is part of the same area, and Oman, what you call West Asia, because I think that is part of this operating area as well. So it has the presence. It launched the Indo-Pacific Tilt, the integrated review, which quick plug, since I was a civil servant involved with the production of that a couple of years ago, just over a year ago, which is really our big strategy document for the next decade, puts India right at the heart of it, and Indo-Pacific at the heart of it. And that means shifting our trade patterns, which will shift as a result of having left the European Union, the European customs area, where I think we will trade more and more with this part of the world. So we do have a stronger trade presence here, which is why we are negotiating the FTA with India and also negotiating to be part of CPTPP, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that, I think, is another anchor into this region. You see it in security and military deployments. I mentioned the Carrier Strike Group. You see it in the shift of our research patterns, actually, as well. So in all these ways, I think the UK will become ever more present in this region. I'd say the UK and France, together with probably the main European countries which have that global presence for various historical reasons. The Quad has been around for a while. It's really, and it sort of waxes and wanes according to perceptions of China and the relationship with the Quad members with China. At the moment, I think all 4 members are pretty aligned in their view of China. The UK has excellent relations with all 4 of those countries: India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. Excellent relations. UK isn't asking to join the Quad. The Quad is an informal grouping. I think whereas we in Europe are very used to quite structured formal groupings, NATO and the EU being the obvious ones, and that's a product of our history after the Second World War and the threat from the Soviet Union. So the different experience in this part of the world, and therefore I think different kinds of relationship. As I say, I don't think the UK is kind of saying, well, we want to join the Quad, that's for the Quad to decide. But what we are doing is working ever more closely with the 4 members of the Quad. And interestingly, I think more with more than one member of the Quad together. So AUKUS, the deal conducted in Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom would be a good example of that. I think we'll look to do more, for example, with India and Japan as we look about sustainable investment. We're just beginning to look at how we might do that more effectively as well. So actually, I think there's quite a lot of scope for greater cooperation in trilateral and minilateral form between the UK and some of these countries.
High Commissioner, you have the last word by definition. So kindly, if you wish, add to anything you have said or any concluding remarks you might have on India, UK and the rest of the world, G7, because all these meetings are going to happen and happening right now.
And so the Commonwealth Summit actually just taking place this weekend as well in Kigali.
Okay.
I would say 2 things. So firstly, I think that a very interesting theme of the next 10 years is going to be the one we were touching on just now, which is the UK and India in other parts of the world. Now, you can see this happening already. You can see it happening in the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative launched by Prime Minister Modi. You can see it in the CDRI, the Resilient Infrastructure Agreement, again set up by Prime Minister Modi, where you're spreading more sustainable infrastructure around the world, and particularly around this region, particularly some of the small islands in this region. We've just launched a thing called the Global Innovation Partnership, which again is a UK-India initiative to try and see if we can pass or seed frugal innovation in other parts of the world. But we've done some pilots for that, particularly in East Africa. So again, I feel we're going to see more and more of this over the next decade. The UK and India working for each other, but also looking at other parts of the world as well. And that could be done bilaterally. It could be done with other countries as well. It could be done in a sort of organized form, a multilateral form, but I think we'll see a lot of it. So that's one thing which I think I would like people to think about over the next decade. The second is just a personal one. I lived here 35 years ago. Both my grandfathers lived here. One in the Indian Army, one in the actually British Army, which went back into West Asia during the First World War. My other grandfather lived here for about 10 years. Curiously, the first words of Hindi I learned without knowing there were words of Hindi. My grandfather, who lived here, loved India. I loved it for the rest of his life. Always loved it. An incredible affection for the country, which you must have come across sometimes when you were in the UK. And he taught my mother to play golf like a good Scot. My mother taught me to play golf like a good Scot. And my mother, when I was a small boy, used to say to me, "You go and be the agewala while I hit the shot." And I had no idea that she was speaking Hindi to me, nor is she, actually. And then when I came here and I started to learn Hindi, I realized it was just a Hindi expression. So there is something unusual, I would say unique in the human relationship between the UK and India. It's not like any other country, I would say, in that respect. And that can be complex, but that flow of people, and it's remarkable. I'm incredibly encouraged that I think, at a long shot, the UK will become next year the biggest, the most demanded country in the world for international students. I think it'll probably overtake the United States next year, probably around well over 500,000. Small numbers by Indian standards, I know, but big by the UK standards. And I'm going to make a guess that India is going to become the single biggest supplier of international students to the UK. About around 100,000 last year. I think we'll get beyond 100,000 this year. The great news is that is not a kind of one-way traffic. Those people will come and go, as you know yourself, will move between the two countries, and I think that's incredibly beneficial for both of our countries. The next step is to get more Brits to come to India, to some of the institutions in India, and get to know India a bit better.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Ellis, High Commissioner. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure our audience will be much better informed about a variety of topics, both bilateral and international, thanks to what you explained in such detail.
Thank you very much.